I went to the hospital for a health check, but the way the nurse suddenly gripped my arm felt anything but routine. She leaned close and whispered, "When the doctor comes in, don't answer to your name. If you admit who you are, you'll never walk out of here again. Pick another name. Now." The fear in her eyes told me she wasn't joking. In that instant, I realized something was terribly wrong, and getting out of that hospital might be the only way to stay alive. Thank you for joining me. Before we continue, please leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from today. Please note certain plot points and names have been fictionalized to enhance the educational value and experience. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental, though the core message is meant for everyone. The rhythmic hiss of a ventilator was the only sound in the room, but the cold metal of a blood pressure cuff tightening around my arm felt like a predator's grip. I, Silas Vane, 68. The man who built Silver Creek Ranch from dust and grit woke up in a sterile hospital bed with the smell of antiseptic masking the sharp scent of betrayal. My vision was a blurred mess of white ceiling tiles and flickering fluorescent tubes that made my head throb with the rhythm of a war drum. I tried to lift my hand, but it felt as heavy as a lead weight, tethered to the bed by wires and tubes. The last thing I remembered was the scent of rain-dampened sage and the sudden unnatural spooking of my horse Renegade. Something had been in the brush that day, something that shouldn't have been there. Now the quiet hum of street. Jude Hospital felt less like a sanctuary and more like a waiting room for a grave I wasn't ready to occupy. A sharp, stinging pain flared behind my ears as I tried to force the fog from my brain. I knew every acre of Silver Creek like the back of my hand, and I knew that horses like Renegade didn't just bolt unless they were forced. As the haze began to thin, a flickering memory sparked a flash of a shadowed figure dressed in dark gear, standing exactly where the trail narrowed near the canyon's edge. It wasn't an accident. I hadn't fallen. I had been pushed by a ghost in the shadows. Have you ever felt the air leave a room before a single word was spoken? That's how the silence felt, when a hand suddenly gripped my wrist, stopping my futile struggle against the bedsheets. Nurse Nora Brooks, 33, leaned over my bed, her name tag glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights as she whispered the warning that saved my life. She was the ICU head nurse, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes that looked like they had seen too much misery to be fooled by a smile. Her grip was firm, urgent, and her breath smelled of peppermint. As she leaned close to my ear, her voice barely a thread of sound. She told me to listen, and to listen well, because we didn't have much time. She said the people coming through that door weren't there to take me home to the ranch, but to sign me away to a place where the sun never reached. She whispered that if I admitted I was Silas Vane, I would never walk out of these halls again. My heart stuttered against my ribs, a cold sweat breaking across my brow that had nothing to do with the fever. I looked at her, searching for a lie, but all I saw was a reflection of a woman who had seen this trap set before. She told me that when the doctor entered, I had to be someone else, anyone else, or the commitment papers already sitting on the nurse's station would become my new reality. "Who are you?" I tried to croak out my throat, feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. "Why are you helping me?" She didn't answer with words, only a tightening of her fingers, and a quick glance toward the heavy wooden door at the end of the ward. Betrayal doesn't bark. It whispers. I could hear the heavy rhythmic click of expensive Italian leather shoes, echoing in the hallway, growing louder with every heartbeat. I closed my eyes for a second, the image of my ranch, the rolling hills, the smell of the herd, the legacy of 3 generations flashing behind my lids. It was all at risk, and the predator was already at the gate. The door swung open with an aggressive thud that vibrated through the metal frame of my bed. Elias Thorne, 38. My son-in-law and a high-flying hedge fund manager walked into the ward with a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He was dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than a year's worth of feed, and he carried a thick black leather briefcase like a shield. Behind him I could see the silhouette of my daughter, but it was Elias who commanded the room, his presence oily and suffocating. He didn't look like a grieving relative. He looked like a man who had just closed a very lucrative deal and was here to collect the collateral. I watched him through narrowed lids, feigning a level of disorientation I no longer truly felt. Nora stepped back, her face becoming a mask of professional indifference, though I could still feel the phantom heat of her warning on my skin. Elias approached the bed, his shadow stretching over me like a shroud. He reached out a hand, touching my shoulder with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. He spoke in a low, soothing tone that was meant to sound comforting, but carried the sharp edge of a blade. He told me that everyone was worried that the accident had been a tragedy, and that the doctors were concerned about my persistent confusion. If you think your own blood wouldn't sell you for a mortgage, you haven't met Elias Thorne. He didn't wait for me to speak. He opened the briefcase, and I caught a glimpse of the documents inside. They weren't medical updates or insurance forms. I recognized the headers even through my blurred vision, psychiatric commitment, and permanent power of attorney. He had planned this. He had the papers ready before the ambulance had even cleared the ranch gates. He was here to bury me alive in a clinical ward, while he liquidated the soil I had spent my life defending. Elias leaned down, his breath smelling of expensive coffee and peppermint, and laid the papers on my chest. He looked at me with a sickening pity that boiled the blood in my veins. "The doctor is here, Silas," he whispered, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Sign the intake form and let us take care of the rest." I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps approaching the bed from behind Elias, and I knew the moment of truth had arrived. The shadow of Elias loomed larger as he nudged the commitment papers closer to my chest, signaling that the executioner had arrived to witness the signing of my soul. Elias didn't blink, his predatory smile remaining fixed as he nudged the psychiatric commitment papers closer to my chest. The door opened fully, and Dr. Iris, a man whose lab coat was as stiff as his professional empathy, entered the room, checking a digital tablet with a furrowed brow. He didn't look at me as a man. He looked at me as a set of symptoms to be cataloged and filed away. Remembering Nurse Nora Brooks's frantic warning, I knew I had to play a part that went against every instinct of a vein. I adopted a blank, glassy stare, letting my jaw slacken just enough to look vacant. When Dr. Aris finally looked up and addressed me as Silas Vane, I let a flicker of forced panic cross my face. I croaked out, my voice thin and trembling. "My name is Arthur Pendergast. I want my breakfast." Why is it so dark in here? I could feel Elias's charming mask slip, a sharp snarl of frustration twitching at the corner of his mouth before he could catch it. He leaned in, his voice a low hiss, telling the doctor that I had been like this since the accident. But then Dr. Aris frowned at his tablet and mentioned something that chilled me further. The intake charts already listed Silas Vane as having a prior diagnosis of late-stage Alzheimer's from a clinic in the city. It was a lie, a fabricated paper trail Elias must have spent months perfecting, but to the medical world it was fact. Lying to your own daughter is a special kind of hell, but watching her husband kill you is worse. My daughter Clara Thorne, 41, stood behind her husband, her eyes red-rimmed, from the lies Elias had been feeding her for months. She was a former school principal, a woman who valued order and truth. Yet here she was, an unwitting accomplice to my destruction. Seeing me claim to be a stranger named Arthur was the breaking point for her. She let out a jagged sob, reaching for the bed rail, but Elias blocked her path with a practiced show of protective concern. Clara broke down in tears, her grief filling the small room until it was suffocating. "Doctor?" Iris, sensing the emotional volatility, took her arm and began leading her toward the doorway to calm her down, explaining the tragedy of cognitive collapse. Elias was forced to follow them, maintaining his persona as the doting, devastated husband. He cast one last warning look over his shoulder, but his attention was tethered to Clara's hysterics. This was it, my only window. My legs felt like two pillars of wet salt, ready to dissolve under the weight of my own survival. I waited until the door was nearly closed, the sound of their voices fading into the hallway. With an agonizing effort that sent white-hot sparks of pain through my healing ribs, I reached up and began disconnecting the monitors. I did it slowly, mimicking the clumsy movements of a confused old man, carefully timing the pulls, so the technical alarms wouldn't trigger a code blue immediately. I rolled off the bed, my feet hitting the cold floor with a thud that felt loud enough to wake the dead. I wasn't the broken man Elias wanted me to be. I was a rancher with 8,500 acres to protect, and I would crawl through glass to get back to my land. I stumbled toward the service corridor Nora had described, my hospital gown fluttering like a white flag of surrender I had no intention of waving. I slipped through the heavy swinging doors, just as a high-pitched chime began to echo behind me. The monitors had finally realized their patient was gone. I heard Elias's voice boom from the main ward, stripped of all its oily charm. "Where is he, Silas?" I ducked into a small room filled with laundry chutes, the smell of damp rain and old laundry rising to meet me. A security guard jogged past the door, his radio crackling with a code silver alert for a patient elopement. I pressed my back against the cold tile, my heart hammering against my ribs, like a trapped bird. Once the footsteps faded, I moved again, navigating the windowless bowels of the hospital. Every turn felt like a gamble, every shadow a potential captor. Have you ever tasted freedom? It usually tastes like exhaust fumes and cold Sacramento rain. I finally found it, the heavy steel door marked with a red service exit sign. I threw my weight against it, and the lock gave way with a metallic groan. The Sacramento air hit me like a physical blow, cold and wet, but it was the most beautiful thing I had ever felt. I didn't stop to celebrate. I moved through the employee parking lot, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could see the perimeter fence and the world beyond it, but the hospital wasn't done with me yet. I spotted my old ranch Jeep parked 3 rows away, but as I moved toward it, I saw something that stopped my heart. A black sedan, the same one I'd seen idling near the entrance earlier, was parked directly across from the service exit. The driver wasn't looking for a parking spot. He was watching the door. The driver of the black sedan stepped out his hand, reaching into his suit jacket with a deliberate, lethal slowness. Just as I realized my ranch Jeep was parked 3 rows away with the tires looking suspiciously flat. The trap hadn't just been in the hospital room. It was waiting for me in the rain. The sound of my key fumbling against the ignition of the Ford echoed in my ears as the stranger from the black sedan began to close the distance. He didn't run. He moved with a deliberate, lethal slowness that suggested he was entirely confident I had nowhere to go. I glanced at my Jeep and my heart sank. The tires weren't just low, they were pancaked against the asphalt, the rubber shredded in a way that screamed sabotage. The man was a slab of granite in a cheap suit, his eyes as vacant as a foreclosure notice, moving with the practiced efficiency of a professional. As he stepped into the light of a street lamp, I saw a small glint on his lapel, a pin from the Silver Creek Ranch security team, my own payroll. Elias hadn't just hired muscle. He had turned my own men, the ones I had trusted to protect my borders, into my executioners. The driver didn't say a word as he reached into his jacket, and I knew I wasn't waiting for a conversation. Relying on decades of rancher grit and the primal surge of adrenaline, I gripped my heavy brass keyring like a dagger. As he reached out to grab my shoulder, I lunged forward with a speed my 68-year-old joints shouldn't have possessed, jabbing the keys into the soft tissue of his throat. He let out a wet, strangled gasp, his hand flying to his neck, and I used those precious seconds to scramble into the driver's seat. I slammed the door and locked it just as his fist hammered against the glass. You ever wonder what the last thought of a dying man is? I'll tell you, it's usually, I should have changed my oil. I didn't have time for philosophy as I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted. The engine roared to life with a defiant, guttural growl that mirrored the rage boiling in my chest. I didn't care about the rims or the shredded rubber. I slammed the Jeep into gear and floored it. The vehicle lurched and screamed as I peeled out of the street. Jude parking lot, narrowly missing a medical transport van. I didn't look back to see if the man in the suit was following. I just needed to get to Highway 49. I needed to get to the ridge. As the hospital faded into the rain-streaked rearview mirror, I noticed the steering was pulling violently to the right, vibrating with a rhythmic thud that rattled my teeth. The smell of hot hydraulic fluid began to fill the small cabin, a sweet, sickly scent that signaled a mechanical catastrophe. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles turned white, fighting the Jeep as it tried to veer into the concrete dividers. Blood is thicker than water, but grease is slicker than both. I realized then that the accident on Renegade hadn't been a stroke of bad luck. Someone had spent time with my equipment. They had calculated the failure points, ensuring that if the horse didn't kill me, The drive home would finish the job. I reached under the dashboard, my fingers searching for the SOS emergency call unit, but all I found was a small plastic box that shouldn't have been there. A high-frequency jammer. Elias had thought of everything. He had cut my tongue out before he even put me in the ground. The rain began to fall harder as I hit the winding mountain passes of Placer County, the world outside becoming a blur of dark pines and gray mist. I was driving on instinct, despite my healing ribs screaming with every bump in the road. I approached the Dead Man's Curve, a notorious hairpin turn with a 500-foot drop into the canyon below. I tapped the brakes to slow my momentum, but the pedal hit the floorboard with a sickening, hollow lack of resistance. There was no pressure, no stopping. I pumped the brakes frantically, the metallic taste of fear-induced bile rising in my throat, but it was like stepping on a cloud. The brake lines hadn't just failed. They had been nicked with surgical precision, designed to hold just long enough for me to reach high speeds on the descent. "Not like this," I whispered, my voice cracking in the empty cabin. "God, not like this." I grabbed the emergency brake and yanked it upward, but the rear tires only fishtailed, sending the Jeep into a violent skid. The Jeep was no longer a vehicle. It was a 2-ton coffin of American steel hurtling toward a pine-scented grave. I shifted into low gear, the transmission screaming in a high-pitched mechanical wail as it tried to eat itself. The screech of metal on the guardrail sparked a shower of orange against the dark forest as I fought to keep the nose of the Jeep on the road. But the momentum was too great, and the steering column felt like it was snapping in my hands. The world began to tilt the horizon line of the mountains, dipping away as the front wheels left the asphalt. In that final weightless moment before the plunge, my hand slipped down the steering column, and my fingers brushed a series of small, jagged indentations etched into the metal. I knew those marks. I had watched Eleanor engrave our initials into the original frame of this Jeep. 18 years ago, a secret promise in the steel. The rear wheels left the asphalt, the world tilting into a nauseating blur of green and gray, just as my fingers brushed a name etched into the steering column that I hadn't seen in 18 years. My own name, Silas, carved next to hers. The silence of the woods waited below, broken only by the ticking of a cooling engine I knew I might never hear again. Pain is a persistent teacher, and right now it was screaming that my ribs were broken and my world was burning. The silence of the woods after the crash was heavy, broken only by the ticking of a cooling engine and the distant rhythmic drip of fuel hitting the dry pine needles. I lay in the dirt, my lungs fighting for air that tasted of iron and smoke, staring up through the canopy at a sky that didn't care if I lived or died. The rear wheels of the Jeep had left the asphalt with a sickening weightlessness, but as I dragged my battered body from the wreckage, my mind was hyper-focused on the name I had seen etched into the steering column. Eleanor, my wife, the woman I had mourned for 18 years. I knew that handwriting better than my own, and seeing it there in the very machine meant to be my coffin felt like a message from beyond the grave. I forced myself to crawl each movement a jagged insult to my healing ribs until I reached the edge of the logging road. I didn't have the luxury of shock. I managed to flag down a passing logging truck by appearing as a confused, injured old man, a role I hated with every fiber of my being, but one that served as the perfect camouflage. As the driver helped me into the cab, I let my head roll back, feigning a daze while my internal compass recalibrated. I wasn't just a rancher anymore. I was a ghost, hunting the men who thought they had already buried me. How much is a man's life worth? In Placer County, apparently, the going rate for a rancher's soul is exactly $8.5 million. I had the driver drop me at the edge of the city, near a district where the neon signs flickered with a desperate dying light. I moved through the shadows, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Elias's reach might extend until I reached a nondescript, low-rent motel on the outskirts of Sacramento. This was the sanctuary of Wyatt Miller, my attorney for 30 years, and a man who wore his integrity like a suit of dented armor. He paced the cramped motel room with a frantic energy I'd never seen before the smell of cheap tobacco and ozone from an old air conditioner hanging heavy in the air. When he saw me standing in the doorway, bloodied and gray with exhaustion, he nearly dropped the glass in his hand. "Silas." "God, I thought you were in memory care or worse." He rasped his eyes, scanning me for the damage. They tried to bury me, Wyatt. They failed, I replied, my voice a low growl that surprised even me. He told me his own office had been ransacked the very night I was taken to street, Jude, and that he had been forced into this hole in the wall to keep the files he had managed to save. Documents don't lie, but the people who print them do. Wyatt began spreading a series of digital printouts across the stained polyester motel bedspread, his hands trembling slightly. He explained that he'd been tracking a massive anomalous lien filed against Silver Creek Ranch, a debt that shouldn't exist. I sat on the edge of a creaking chair, the sharp sting of antiseptic from a first aid kit biting into my open cuts as I watched him work. He zoomed in on a document that looked like a standard mortgage, but the numbers were anything but standard. It was a fraudulent $8. $5 million mortgage held by a shell company in the Cayman Islands, carrying a predatory 28% interest rate. My heart didn't just sink, it turned to stone. Every single page bore my signature executed with a level of perfection that made me question my own reality for a fleeting, terrifying second. But then I saw it. I leaned closer, the crinkle of heavy bond paper loud in the quiet room, and noticed a tiny consistent flaw in the cursive, a slight hitch in the V of vein that I had never made, but that I recognized from somewhere else. This isn't a loan, Silas. It's an execution of your entire estate, Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a whisper. It's designed to default in 60 days, giving the shell company total ownership of the land. I stared at the paper, the flickering neon light outside the motel window, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the death warrant of my family legacy. I didn't sign these, I said, the calculated fury finally reaching my throat. But I know who taught the person who did. Wyatt revealed that the accident I had on Renegade wasn't just a murder attempt. It was the specific legal trigger needed to activate a dormant power of attorney Elias had filed months ago. The motel room smelled like cheap tobacco and the stale sweat of a man who knew he was being hunted, and as Wyatt pulled up the final verification page, the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. He discovered that the notary who had verified the forged signatures wasn't a stranger. As Wyatt zoomed in on the notary's stamp, the name listed wasn't a stranger's. It was a name I had associated with my son's gambling debts for years. The betrayal wasn't just coming from the man who had married into my family. It was being fed by the one I had raised to inherit it. I looked at the name on the stamp, the ink appearing black and cold against the page, and I realized that my son Caleb hadn't just been a witness to my decline. He had been the pen that wrote the end of Silver Creek Ranch. The shrill ring of my burner phone vibrating against the nightstand shattered the silence, showing a number I'd blocked a year ago, and I knew the time for hiding was over. The burner phone felt like a live wire in my hand, humming with the potential to either save my family or burn it to the ground. The shrill ring of my burner phone vibrating against the nightstand shattered the silence, showing a number I'd blocked a year ago. It was Caleb. My hands were steady, carved from the same stubborn oak as the fence posts at Silver Creek, despite the cold fury swirling in my chest. I answered, and my son's voice flooded the room, frantic and thin. He sounded like a man drowning in his own lies, claiming that Elias had gone too far and that the hospital incident wasn't his doing. He told me I needed to get to the old mountain cabin, a family safe house tucked away in the dense timber of Placer County. I listened to his desperate pleas, but my ears weren't tuned to his words. I was listening for the tiny mechanical click of a secondary line being monitored. There it was, a faint metallic hiccup in the static. Elias was listening. I knew then that Caleb wasn't calling to rescue me. He was calling to leash me. Do you know the sound of a heart breaking? It's not a loud crack. It's the silent hum of a monitored phone line. I told Caleb I'd meet him there in 3 hours, my voice a perfect mask of weary trust. But as soon as the line went dead, I looked at Wyatt. He's with him. I said the words, tasting like ash. Caleb Vane. My 34-year-old son had hovered in the hallway of my memory as a boy who just needed a little guidance. But the man on the phone was a professional gambler who had sold his soul to pay a debt he couldn't afford. I knew I couldn't just walk into that cabin, but I needed to see the betrayal for myself. Instead of taking the main logging road, I circled around the back of the ridge, moving through the dense brush and damp pine needles of the high country. The air was cold, biting at my lungs, but the physical pain in my ribs was a distant hum compared to the weight of the vintage binoculars in my hand. I reached a rocky outcrop overlooking the safe house and waited. Through the lenses, I saw Caleb pacing the porch, looking haggard and broken. For a split second, I wanted to run down there and hold him. Then the barn doors slid open. I saw two dark SUVs tucked inside the shadows, and Elias Thorne stepped out checking his watch, with the casual arrogance of a man waiting for a delivery. I watched as Caleb walked over and handed his own burner phone to Elias, their heads bowed in a conversation I didn't need to hear to understand. Trust is a luxury I can no longer afford. Survival is a debt I refuse to pay. My son wasn't waiting to save me. He was the bait in a steel-jawed trap. I retreated from the ridge, moving deeper into the timber where the wind howled through the canopy like a choir of the damned. I felt a sudden sharp pinch in the lining of my coat, the heavy field jacket Caleb had insisted I wear when I visited him last month. I reached into the seam, my fingers finding a small, hard lump that hadn't been there when I bought the coat. I ripped the fabric open with my pocket knife, and a professional-grade GPS tracker fell into my palm. It blinked with a steady, malevolent red light, a digital eye that had been watching my every move since I left the hospital. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Even if I hadn't answered the phone, Elias would have hunted me down, like an animal using my own son's gift. The GPS tracker sat in my palm like a plastic parasite, feeding on my location and shitting out my betrayal. I stood there in the shadows of the pines, the red light reflecting off the chrome of my knife, and I realized that my own blood had turned me into a target for sport. But I wasn't ready to be mounted on a wall yet. I looked down the trail toward the valley floor, where the distant rumble of a logging truck echoed through the canyons. A plan began to take shape, cold and precise. I didn't destroy the tracker. Instead, I moved toward the roadside, where the heavy trucks slowed for the hairpin turns. I waited until a massive Peterbilt, hauling a load of cedar, rumbled past, heading toward the Nevada border. With a flick of my wrist, I attached the magnetic tracker to the truck's rear axle. "Lead them to Reno," I whispered as the taillights faded into the mist. I watched as the two SUVs from the cabin suddenly roared to life, their headlights cutting through the woods as they began to pursue the digital ghost I had just sent across state lines. They were gone, following a phantom leaving the heart of the ranch unguarded for the first time in days. I turned my back on the cabin and the sun I no longer recognized. My destination was no longer a safe house. It was the one place Elias would never think to look, because he believed it was a tomb. I headed for the storm cellar of Silver Creek Ranch. It was a place where the air smelled of wet earth and copper, a place where I had buried my grief 18 years ago. But the etching I had seen in the Jeep and the perfection of the forgeries suggested that the cellar might hold more than just memories. As the logging truck rumbled away, drawing the SUVs with it, I turned toward the one place Elias would never think to look, the storm cellar of Silver Creek Ranch, where the ghosts of 18 years ago still breathed. The crunch of dead leaves under my boots was the only sound as I approached the perimeter of my own kingdom, now a fortress of lies. I wasn't just a rancher returning home. I was a predator entering a cage, and I knew that whatever I found beneath those floorboards would change the vain name forever. Silver Creek Ranch looked different through the eyes of a fugitive. The sprawling pastures I'd once loved now felt like a hunting ground, and I was the trophy. The crunch of dead leaves under my boots as I approached the perimeter of my own kingdom, now a fortress of lies, sent a jolt of ice through my veins. The storm was my only ally, providing a curtain of gray rain that blurred the horizon and muffled the sound of my movement. I moved with a predator's caution, skirting the fence line where the shadows of the oaks were deepest. I reached the north fence, a section of the property that bordered a deep irrigation ravine. I knew every inch of this dirt, and more importantly, I knew about the drainage pipe that ran beneath the perimeter. My ribs flared with white-hot pain as I lowered myself into the muck, the smell of wet earth and copper rising to meet me. I crawled through the dark, cramped space, my breath hitching as I felt the vibration of a heavy vehicle passing on the road above. When I emerged on the other side, I stayed low in the tall grass watching the main house. Elias had been busy. High-intensity floodlights now ringed the property, casting long, artificial fingers of light across the drive. I observed two unfamiliar security guards patrolling the porch, their movements stiff and professional. This wasn't local talent. These were city men in tactical gear. The ranch was no longer my home. It was a fortress I had to invade. A ranch isn't just land, it's a witness. And mine was currently screaming that I was an intruder. I kept my distance from the floodlights, realizing that they weren't just positioned to keep people out. They were angled with a curious precision, as if designed to keep someone from leaving the house through the basement exits. I didn't head for the front door. Instead, I worked my way toward the equipment barn, a massive structure of timber and tin that stood like a sentinel near the old orchard. Beneath its floorboards sat the storm cellar, a secret refuge my father and I had built together decades ago. It was a place for tornadoes and hard times, a subterranean sanctuary that the rest of the world had forgotten. As I slipped through the side door of the barn, the rhythmic drumming of rain on the tin roof created a frantic metallic symphony. I reached the rusted hatch hidden under a stack of moth-eaten wool blankets. Prying it open required a strength I wasn't sure I had left the iron handle biting into my calloused palm with a sharp metallic tang. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the temperature drop 10 degrees? That's not physics. That's a secret waiting to be told. I descended the ladder, my flashlight beam cutting through the stagnant air. I had buried 18 years of grief in this cellar, prayers to an empty grave for Eleanor, the wife I was told had perished in a fire that left nothing but ash. But the etching in the Jeep and the meticulous forgeries had planted a seed of doubt that was now blooming into a terrifying certainty. I reached the bottom and panned the light around the room. The air was cold and damp, but as the beam hit the floor, my heart stopped. The thick layer of dust that should have blanketed the cellar had been swept away, leaving a clear, clean path from the ladder to the far corner. I stepped forward, my boots making no sound on the packed earth. On a wooden shelf where I used to keep emergency rations, I found a small, crumpled piece of paper. I picked it up, the bond paper, feeling modern and crisp. It was a grocery receipt from a store in town dated only 2 days ago. Fresh bread, bottled water, and a brand of tea Eleanor used to love. You don't buy these things for a ghost. The grocery receipt in my hand felt heavier than the $8.5 million mortgage. One was a theft of money, the other was a theft of time. I moved deeper into the cellar, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I found a stack of letters tucked behind a crate of old jars. They weren't yellowed with age. They were fresh, the ink dark and the paper white. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Caleb's frantic looping script. I read the first few lines, my vision blurring with rage. He was begging her to be patient, promising that it would all be over soon if she just kept quiet a little longer. He wasn't just a gambler, he was a jailer. My son had been writing to a woman he told me was dead for nearly 2 decades. The realization was a physical blow, a weight that threatened to crush the air from my lungs. I looked toward the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I panned the light slowly, my thumb hovering over the switch, terrified of what the beam would reveal. The cellar wasn't empty. It was occupied. The silence was broken by a soft rhythmic sound, the sound of shallow, terrified breathing. The flashlight beam caught a movement in the far corner, a hand pale and trembling, reaching out from behind a stack of moth-eaten wool blankets. It was a human hand, the skin like parchment, reaching for a glass of water that sat on a nearby crate. The flashlight was shaking so hard now that the beam danced across the walls like a panicked bird. I stood there rooted to the spot, the ghosts of 18 years ago suddenly manifesting in the dark. The shadow in the corner began to take shape, moving with a slow, agonizing grace that I would have known in any lifetime. I wanted to scream, to run, to turn off the light and pretend the world was still the lie I had lived, but my legs wouldn't move. My hand remained frozen on the light as the blankets shifted, and I knew that whatever I saw next would either save my soul or destroy what was left of my mind. My thumb hovered over the flashlight switch, terrified that the light would either reveal a ghost or a monster, and I wasn't sure which would be worse. The flashlight shaking in my hand as the shadow in the corner began to take shape felt like a bridge crossing into a world where the laws of life and death no longer applied. I clicked the beam high. Eleanor Vane, 64. The woman I had buried in my heart 18 years ago stepped out of the cellar shadows, looking like a ghost with a vendetta. She was thin, her skin the color of old parchment, and mapped with lines of grief I hadn't been there to soothe, but her eyes carried a fire of survival that I recognized instantly. They were the same green eyes that had looked at me across the altar, now wide with a soul-crushing shock. "Silas," she whispered, her voice a scratchy, dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering across a porch. You're not supposed to be here. He said you'd be gone by now." "I've spent 18 years visiting a headstone, Eleanor." I managed to choke out the flashlight beam, dancing wildly as my knees threatened to buckle. "How are you standing in front of me?" We stood in that damp, iron-scented tomb for what felt like an eternity, the rhythmic drumming of the rain above us serving as the only proof that time hadn't stopped entirely. 18 years. That's 6,570 days of living with a ghost, only to find out the ghost was breathing all along. She reached out her fingers, grazing my arm with a touch so light I thought she might dissolve into mist. But the warmth of her skin was undeniable. She began to weep, a silent, shoulder-shaking sob that broke the last of my composure. I pulled her into my arms, the smell of damp wool and old paper clinging to her, and for a moment the ranch and the mortgage and the manhunt ceased to exist. But the questions were a rising tide I couldn't ignore. Eleanor pulled back just enough to look me in the eye, her expression hardening into something sharp and terrified. She began to recount the night of the car fire, and as she spoke, the architecture of a 20-year lie began to rise around us. She hadn't died in that flames. She had been drugged and extracted from the wreckage before the fuel tank blew. Elias Thorne didn't just build a trap. He wove a web of our own skin and bone. He had been a young, ambitious shadow, back then working the ranch's books, and he had faked the death certificates to get the one person who could spot his embezzlement out of the way. For nearly 2 decades he had moved her from one safe house to another, using her as human leverage to keep Caleb under his thumb. She told me that every time Caleb tried to pull away, Elias would show him a live feed of her in a cell and remind him that her life depended on his silence. Before I reveal the detail that changes everything about that night in the barn, are you still with me? Choose A if you think Silas should flee with her now, or B if he should stay to fight. And add one reason so I can see your perspective. Please note the next part includes adapted details for storytelling purposes, to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. If you prefer strictly factual retellings, you are free to stop here. Eleanor reached into a hidden pocket of her sweater and pulled out a small leather-bound ledger. She had managed to steal Elias's personal records during his last visit. As I flipped through the pages, I found evidence that turned my stomach. Caleb wasn't just a victim. He had actually helped Elias fake the death certificate 18 years ago to pay off his very first gambling debt. Would you kill the man you called your son if it meant saving the woman you called your wife? The betrayal was total, a rot that had started at the center of my family and spread until nothing was left but the husk of Silver Creek. Eleanor revealed Elias's ultimate endgame, the $8. $5 million mortgage was the setup to default, allowing a shell company Eleanor was forced to sign for to seize the land. Elias planned to make my dead wife the legal fall woman for the entire fraud, ensuring he walked away with the cash while she went to a real prison. "We're done hiding in the dirt, Silas," she said, her voice gaining a steel I hadn't heard since we were young. "I want my life back." I looked at her, then at the ladder leading up to the world that had tried to erase us. We formed the vain covenant, right then in the dark and the damp. We would give Elias exactly what he wanted, a defeated, senile old man and a silent ghost, until the Silver Creek Festival. That was where his hubris would be at its peak, and that was where we would tear his world down. I gripped Eleanor's hand, the skin like parchment, as a heavy thud sounded from the barn floor above us, followed by the unmistakable click of a safety being disengaged. The vibration of the barn floorboards through the cellar ceiling told me the hunter had finally found the entrance to the grave. Dust sifted through the floorboards like fine sand in an hourglass, marking the seconds I had left before the men above decided to stop walking and start shooting. The vibration of the barn floorboards through the cellar ceiling felt like a physical weight pressing down on Eleanor and me. We remained frozen in the shadows, my hand covering her mouth, as we listened to the rhythmic thud of heavy boots passing directly over the rusted hatch. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat a frantic warning. I realized then that Elias's security team wasn't just conducting a casual search. They were systematic and cold. From my low vantage point, I could see the glint of a tool through the gaps in the wood. They were installing motion sensors at every exit, effectively turning the ranch into a high-tech cage for a man they thought was still lurking in the tall grass. Once the footsteps finally faded toward the main house, I exhaled a breath I didn't know I was holding. We had to move. I guided Eleanor through a hidden ventilation duct I'd built years ago, a narrow crawl space that led out into the dense brush of the orchard. Under the cover of the pre-dawn fog, we navigated the property like ghosts, reaching a remote line shack on the edge of the northern pasture by 3 a.m. A man's reputation takes a lifetime to build, and 40 seconds of faked video to bury. As the first gray light of morning bled into the sky, I found a discarded tablet in the shack, likely left behind by a careless ranch hand. My thumb trembled as I swiped the screen, and my stomach did a slow, sickening roll. Elias had launched his digital execution. A deepfake video was pinned to the top of the county's social media feed, showing a hyper-realistic version of me brutally striking a young worker while screaming incoherent threats about trespassers on my land. It was perfect. The lighting, the gravelly tone of my voice, even the specific way I tilted my head when I was angry. By 7 a.m., the local news was broadcasting a dangerous person alert. I watched the screen with a hollow sense of betrayal, as Sheriff Hank, a man who had shared 100 Sunday dinners at my table, stood on the ridge with a bullhorn and a sidearm. His voice amplified into a booming instrument of the law, backed by the sworn statements of Elias's hand-picked witnesses, declared me armed and dangerous. Have you ever been hunted on the ground you paid for in blood and sweat? It changes the way the dirt feels under your boots. I looked through my binoculars toward the ridge, hoping for some sign of reason, but my breath caught in my throat. Standing next to Elias, as he directed the sheriff's team, was my daughter Clara. Her face was set in a mask of convinced hatred, her eyes scanning the tree line as if she were looking for a rabid animal rather than her own father. It was the ultimate betrayal, fueled by a digital lie she had no reason to doubt. Eleanor gripped my arm, her own eyes filling with tears as she saw our daughter on the side of the predator. "We can't stay here, Silas," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the wind. "Elias isn't just taking the ranch, he's erasing the man who owns it." The sirens began to wail on the distant highway at 11 a.m., a coordinated scream that signaled the start of the manhunt. I knew I couldn't lead the law back to the cellar. I had to take Eleanor deeper into the rugged canyon lands, a place we called the Devil's Wash. It was a jagged landscape of dry creek beds and ancient caves, where GPS signals failed and horses couldn't find easy footing. The physical toll was immense. My healing ribs screamed with every jagged breath, and Eleanor's legs were beginning to give out. We moved downwind of the sheriff's bloodhounds, using the alkaline springs to mask our scent, but I knew we were running out of time. The sirens weren't just noise, they were the howling of a town I'd served for decades, now hungry for my head. We reached the mouth of a narrow canyon, the sun beating down with a merciless October heat that turned the red rocks into ovens. I felt like a stranger on my own land, a fugitive in the kingdom I had spent 40 years building. Every shadow looked like a deputy. Every rustle of the sagebrush sounded like a tactical team closing in. I looked at Eleanor, her face pale and streaked with dust, and felt a surge of righteously angry energy. Elias wanted a war, and I was finally ready to give him one. But first, I had to keep us alive. A shadow flickered over the canyon wall, cutting through the glare of the sun. It wasn't a bird. I looked up and saw the metallic glint of a drone, silent and deadly, hovering exactly where Eleanor had stumbled into the light just a moment before. It sat there in the still air, its camera lens a cold, unblinking eye that saw everything. I pulled Eleanor back into the crevice of a rock, but the high-pitched whine of the drone rotors began to increase as it dove toward our position. It had found us. The mechanical predator was calling the pack, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the cold, sharp edge of true panic. The drone dipped lower its thermal sensors, likely painting our heat signatures in bright, undeniable oranges and reds against the cool blue of the stone. I gripped Eleanor's hand, my mind racing through every trail and every cave in the wash, searching for a way to blind the eye in the sky before the dust of the canyon became our final resting place. I didn't have a surface-to-air missile, but I had a high-powered spotlight and a lifetime of knowing exactly where the shadows were deepest in Devil's Wash. The high-pitched whine of the drone diving toward our position was a mechanical scream that tore through the canyon's natural silence. I looked at Eleanor, whose face was a mask of exhausted terror, and I knew I had seconds to act. We were pinned against the cool blue stone of the canyon wall, our heat signatures lighting up Elias's screen like a pair of flares. I lunged for the old metal searchlight we'd grabbed from the lined shack earlier, a heavy piece of equipment that smelled of dust and old grease. With a grunt of effort that sent a fresh spike of pain through my ribs, I aimed the lens directly at the descending shadow and flipped the switch. A blinding cone of white light erupted from the canyon floor, a miniature sun that slammed into the drone's optical sensors. The machine wavered its software, likely struggling to compensate for the massive light flare, and I used that window of technical blindness to haul Eleanor into a dense thicket of scrub oak. A drone is just a bird with a soul made of silicon and a heart of plastic. You don't outrun it, you outthink it. We moved through a hidden ravine, the air thick with the scent of scorched sage and dry dust, until we reached the old line shack, nestled in the northern woods. It was a humble place, but to us it was a cathedral of safety. It was there we met our secret ally. Brick's a man whose skin was as weathered as an old saddle, and whose loyalty was the only thing Elias Thorne couldn't buy, emerged from the brush, smelling of wood smoke and hope. He had been my foreman for 40 years, and seeing his face in the dim light was the first bit of real peace I'd felt since the hospital. He didn't waste time with sentiment. He handed me a bag of supplies and a small digital recorder he'd managed to hide before Elias purged the ranch's local servers. Bricks revealed that Elias wasn't just planning a land deal. He was going to announce a massive land conservation agreement at the annual Silver Creek Festival. To the public, it would look like a noble legacy, but Bricks had seen the true ledgers. It was the final stage of the $8.5 million liquidation. The truth is a loud noise. Most people are just too afraid to turn up the volume. We spent the night in that shack, a small bubble of resistance in a county that wanted my head. Bricks told us that Elias had been using the ranch's high-tech thermal, imaging the same system I'd paid for to track the health of our herds, to patrol the borders for trespassers like me. The irony was a bitter pill, but it fueled the righteous anger that kept me moving. By the morning of the 7th day, the festival preparations had reached a fever pitch. We could hear the rhythmic thumping of the bass from the main stage, even from the woods. Bricks had managed to smuggle me into the equipment barn near the VIP area, under a load of hay. The barn smelled of ozone and hot solder as we set to work. Bricks had spent the last few years maintaining the new digital sound upgrades Elias had installed, and he knew the system's back doors. I watched his calloused fingers move with precision as he wired a hidden receiver to the main PA speakers. My part was simpler, but no less critical. I took out my expensive fountain pen, the same one Elias had tried to force into my hand at the hospital, and tested the internal microphone Bricks had rigged for me. How many wires does it take to dismantle a 20-year lie? Apparently just 2 red for anger and black for the truth. One click of this pen and the whole world hears him for who he really is. I whispered, the weight of the moment pressing down on my shoulders. Bricks looked at me, his eyes grave. If this fails Silas, we aren't just losing the ranch. We're going to prison. I nodded, checking the signal strength on the receiver. We were betting everything on Elias's arrogance. We needed him to believe he'd already won to get him talking in that soundproof VIP booth where he thought he was untouchable. As the morning sun climbed higher, the festival grounds filled with thousands of locals, neighbors, friends, and workers who had all seen the deepfake of me as a violent madman. I felt like a ghost haunting my own funeral, watching the preparations for a celebration that was meant to mark my end. Eleanor stayed hidden in the shadows of the barn, her hand gripping mine one last time, before Bricks signaled that the VIPs were arriving. I watched through a gap in the timber as black SUVs pulled up to the hill where the white tents were being raised. Elias stepped out, looking every bit the triumphant king of Silver Creek, his navy suit gleaming in the sun. But he wasn't alone. Bricks pointed toward the hill where the VIP tents were being raised, his hand shaking. "He's bringing the notary Silas, the one who signed your death warrant. He's ending this tonight." I saw the small rodent-like man trailing behind Elias, clutching a leather briefcase. This was it. The legal execution of my legacy was scheduled for the keynote speech. The first firework exploded over Silver Creek like a signal for a war I was finally ready to win. I adjusted my hospital-issued tracker, now dead and useless, and gripped my pen mic. I was a 68-year-old rancher with broken ribs and a dead wife who was very much alive, and I was about to turn the volume of the truth up until the whole world felt the vibration. The first fireworks streaked into the sky a blooming crown of red that mirrored the rage I'd kept under lock and key for 18 long years. I stood on the edge of the VIP grounds, my heart keeping time with the distant boom of the pyrotechnics. Silver Creek was alive with the sound of music and laughter, 1,000 people celebrating a harvest I had planted and they intended to steal. I adjusted my posture, letting my shoulders sag and my gaze turn vacant, preparing for the Trojan horse gambit. I purposefully stumbled near the guarded entrance of the VIP tent, making sure to trip over my own boots in full view of the security detail. As I had expected, 2 of Elias's hired muscle moved in immediately. They didn't help me up with care. They hauled me to my feet by my elbows, their grips tight enough to bruise. I let my head loll, muttering nonsense about where Renegade had gone, playing the part of the senile old man who had finally lost his way. They dragged me inside the private booth, a sound-dampened sanctuary of mahogany and leather that smelled of expensive cigar smoke and burnt gunpowder. Elias was waiting there, his navy suit sharp enough to cut, standing beside a small rodent-like man named Miller. The notary was a man who kept adjusting his spectacles and avoided my gaze as if he could smell the illegality on the very papers he held. Elias looked at me with a sickening mix of triumph and disgust, pushing a thick stack of transfer documents across the table. "Look at him, Caleb," he said, his voice dripping with oily condescension, the great Silas vein reduced to drooling in the dirt. I just whimpered, leaning heavily on my expensive fountain pen, ensuring it was positioned perfectly near the center of the table. Have you ever watched a man celebrate his victory 10 seconds before the floor falls out from under him? That was the look on Elias's face as he motioned for my son to enter the room. Caleb walked in his face a mask of sweating terror and shame. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week, his eyes darting between me and the black briefcase. Elias didn't even give him a chance to speak before he began to mock him, revealing the full extent of the gambling debt and how he had used it to force Caleb to sabotage my horse. My blood boiled, but I kept my face blank, my thumb hovering over the silent click of the pen mic. I realized then that I had already won a smaller battle. I had planted a secondary recording device in Caleb's pocket during our safe house confrontation, and I knew Bricks was already monitoring the feed, but I needed the confession for the whole world to hear. I accidentally clicked the pen, a tiny mechanical snap that went unnoticed in the soundproof room. Betrayal is a debt, and tonight I was the taxman. Elias, thinking he was untouchable in his private kingdom, began to brag. He spoke of the $8.5 million fraud like it was a work of art. He laughed about the deepfake he'd used to turn the town against me and his plan to retire me to a locked ward facility where I'd never see the sun again. He even boasted about how easy it had been to keep Eleanor in the ground while he drained the Vane legacy dry. "Once he signs, the ranch is gone and the Vane name dies with it," Elias sneered, shoving the gold-nibbed pen toward my trembling hand. I didn't reach for the paper. Instead, I stood up straight, the senile fog vanishing from my eyes with a clarity that made Elias recoil. The music outside suddenly cut to a screeching halt, replaced by a blast of static that tore through the festive air. Then Elias's own voice began to boom over the valley, distorted but unmistakable broadcasting, his admission of murder and theft to the thousands of people gathered on the ranch. Elias's voice boomed over the valley like a dying god's last confession, shattering the silence of Silver Creek. The silence that followed from the crowd was more deafening than the fireworks. Thousands of my neighbors, my friends, and the workers I had raised stood frozen, hearing the truth for the first time. The pen isn't just for signing Elias, I said, my voice low and steady. It's for speaking. His face went from flushed with greed to a ghostly, sickly white. He screamed at Miller to turn it off to find the sound guy, but I knew Bricks had the system locked down. Elias realized the gravity of what had happened. The sheriff had been listening to the feed on a private channel for the last 10 minutes, a backup I'd arranged with Wyatt before the first fuse was lit. The hubris that had fueled his 20-year plan was now the very thing that had hung him. He looked at Caleb, who had collapsed into a chair, then back at me with a raw, animalistic desperation. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed, though his voice lacked its previous power. "I have the papers, I have the law," but the law was already tearing through the tent flap. Elias lunged across the table, his fingers clawing for my throat, in a final frantic attempt to silence the source. I didn't flinch. I watched his fingers close in just as the canvas walls were ripped open. The glint of the sheriff's badge caught the red light of the dying fireworks, and the sound of the crowd's roar began to swell like a tidal wave against the thin walls of the VIP booth. The predatory focus I had maintained for days didn't break, even as the chaos of explosive justice finally erupted around us. The canvas walls of the VIP booth didn't just tear, they exploded inward under the weight of 1,000 angry voices screaming for the truth. The sound of the crowd's roar swelling like a tidal wave against the thin canvas was the last thing Elias heard before his world came crashing down. As he lunged across the table, his fingers clawing for my throat, in a desperate attempt to silence the source, Sheriff Hank moved with a speed that belied his age. He intercepted Elias midair, slamming him against the mahogany table with a force that made the wood groan in protest. The expensive crystal decanter shattered, spilling amber liquid across the fraudulent documents, like blood on a battlefield. I stood in the center of the storm, my breathing calm as I reached down to retrieve my microphone pen. Elias's mask of civilization had finally shattered into raw, animalistic screaming, his face a mottled purple as he kicked against the floor. "It's over." "Elias," I said, my voice cutting through his hysterics with the weight of 18 years of silence, "the whole valley just heard you bury yourself. Outside, the perimeter security I had worried about was nowhere to be found. Instead, I saw my own ranch hands led by Bricks flanking the entrance. I had revealed to them days ago that the security Elias hired were outsiders meant to replace them, and their loyalty to Silver Creek had done the rest. Elias Thorne was like a house built on sand, impressive to look at until the tide of the truth finally came in. As the deputies struggled to pull Elias away and began the process of handcuffing a sobbing, broken Caleb and the trembling notary, a sudden hush fell over the area. The crowd at the front of the stage parted like the Red Sea, falling into a silence so profound it felt like the earth itself had stopped breathing. Eleanor Vane stepped through the torn tent flap and into the blinding white of the festival floodlights. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She stood with her head high, the silver in her hair gleaming like a crown under the harsh glare. Have you ever seen a man realize he's lost his soul and his bank account in the same breath? It's a quiet, hollow sound. That was the sound that escaped Caleb as he looked up from the floor, his eyes widening in a terror that bordered on madness. "Mom," he whispered the word, a fragile, broken thing. Eleanor didn't look at the crowd. She looked at her son with a mixture of soul-deep pity and forged steel. 18 years, Elias," she said, her voice amplified by the silence of the thousands watching. "I'm not a secret you can keep in the dirt anymore." The presence of the woman they had all mourned acted as the final undeniable nail in the coffin Elias had built for himself. The shock was so complete that even the sheriff stood frozen for a heartbeat, staring at the woman he had once helped me bury. The law is slow, but when it arrives, it's heavy. The rhythmic wail of high-powered sirens suddenly drowned out the dying embers of the festival music as black SUVs bearing federal plates pulled pulled onto the grass, their tires churning up the dirt I had spent my life defending. Wyatt Miller stepped out of the lead vehicle, his suit rumpled from a long night of coordination, but his eyes were bright with a triumphant fire. He wasn't carrying local paperwork. He held a briefcase full of the original, untampered ranch ledgers Eleanor had meticulously saved, and FBI warrants for wire fraud money laundering, an interstate conspiracy. Elias began to scream about lawyers and his phone, but the federal agents moved in with a clinical, cold efficiency that didn't leave room for negotiation. Wyatt walked over to me, clapping a hand on my shoulder as he watched Elias being loaded into the back of a van. "The mortgage is dead, Silas," he said, his voice low and steady, "and so is Thorne's fund." He explained that while the local broadcast had provided the public reckoning, the digital trail Eleanor had stolen was the true evidence. Elias hadn't just been trying to steal my land. He had been using Silver Creek as collateral to launder millions for a casino syndicate that was already facing its own federal heat. The complexity of the fraud was staggering, reaching from the local notary all the way to offshore accounts in the Caymans. I looked around the wreckage of the VIP booth at the faces of my neighbors who were still reeling from the broadcast, and felt a strange, hollow sense of victory. The predator was gone, but the wounds he had inflicted on my family were still raw and bleeding. Caleb was led away in a separate car, his head bowed, in a shame that no amount of time could fully erase. I saw Clara standing on the edge of the light, her face pale and her eyes searching mine for an answer I wasn't sure I could give yet. She had heard the truth, but the echoes of Elias's lies were still ringing in her ears. As the feds led Elias away, Wyatt leaned in and whispered, "There's one more signature in the back of the files, Silas. One that isn't a forgery, and it's going to break your heart." I looked at the briefcase, the weight of his words settled in my gut like lead. I thought the betrayals were over, that the truth had finished its harvest. But the look on Wyatt's face told me there was one final ghost waiting in the ranch office. And this one didn't belong to Eleanor or Elias. The rain continued to wash over the crime scene as the federal SUVs disappeared into the mist, taking Elias and Caleb toward a future of iron bars and concrete walls. The ranch office was quiet enough to hear the ghost of my father's pulse in the floorboards, but the paper in my hand was screaming a truth I wasn't ready to hear. The silence of the ranch office, where the ghosts of the past finally sat down to talk, felt heavier than any storm I'd ever faced. Wyatt Miller sat across from me, his expression grave as he slid a single, unassuming folder toward my calloused hands. This was the one he'd warned me about, the file containing the final, genuine signature that wasn't a product of Elias's forgery. I opened it with a trembling thumb, my breath hitching as I looked at a durable power of attorney for healthcare. It was a cold clinical document that would have allowed Elias to make end-of-life decisions on my behalf if the horse accident had left me comatose. My heart didn't just break. It felt like it was being ground into the dust of Silver Creek. There at the bottom of the page was my daughter's real signature, clear and unmistakable. "She signed it, Wyatt," I whispered, the words catching in my dry throat as I felt the weight of her unintentional betrayal. "She signed my death warrant because he told her it was routine paperwork, and she trusted him enough to never look twice." Wyatt reached out, placing a steady, weathered hand on the desk, offering the kind of silent support only 30 years of friendship could provide. She didn't know Silas. Ignorance isn't malice, but it still draws blood, and Elias was a master at bleeding people dry, while they smiled back at him. Trust is a mirror. Once it's shattered, you can glue it back together, but the cracks still show your reflection in pieces. I looked at the handwriting, the same looping C I'd seen on 100 Father's Day cards, and realized that Caleb wasn't the only child Elias had manipulated into the dark. He had used Clara's blind loyalty to her husband to turn her into an unwitting accomplice in her own father's potential execution. It was a sobering realization that made the victory at the festival feel like it was covered in ash. I found out later, as Wyatt dug through the encrypted logs of the ranch's internal network, that Caleb actually tried to call the sheriff the night of the horse accident. He had stood in the stables with a shaking hand, but Elias had intercepted the call at the rooting level, proving a small spark of conscience remained in my son even as he was drowning in the debts that had nearly cost us everything. The door to the office creaked open, a sound that seemed to echo through the empty hallways of my legacy, and Clara stood there. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow from a week of relentless weeping and the sudden violent shattering of her world. She looked at the document in my hand, and then at me, her knees buckling until she was kneeling on the worn rug of my father's office. How do you forgive a daughter for signing your life away? You remember the day you taught her to ride, and you realize you never taught her how to spot a snake in the tall grass. I almost killed you, Dad. She sobbed, the salt of her tears hitting the floorboards like rain. I believed him over you because I was too proud to admit I'd married a monster. I let him tell me you were losing your mind while he was taking your life one signature at a time. I looked past her to the doorway where Eleanor stood, her presence a living bridge between the wreckage of our past and the hope of our future. The wife I thought I had lost 18 years ago was finally home, and her eyes were fixed on our broken daughter with a forgiveness that only a mother could possess. We were all ghosts in this house, Clara, I said, my voice gaining the strength I didn't know I still possessed as I rose from the desk. It's time we started living in the light again, regardless of the scars we carry. I reached down and pulled my daughter to her feet, breaking the cycle of vengeance with a single heavy embrace that smelled of cedarwood and the end of a long, dark road. As I cleared out Elias's old desk later that afternoon, a task that felt like exorcising a demon, I found a letter from Eleanor, written 18 years ago, that Elias had hidden in a false bottom, a letter that proved she never stopped trying to get back to me, even when she was locked in the darkness of his various safe houses. The sun wasn't just setting on the day, it was setting on 18 years of lies, painting the valley in the colors of a hard-won peace that I had almost forgotten existed. I walked out onto the ridge overlooking Silver Creek as the 2025 vintage was finally bottled and the spring vines began to bud. The rhythmic sound of crickets in the tall grass, a peaceful contrast to the sirens of a week ago. The legal victory was absolute. The $8.5 million debt had been annulled by the feds, and the ranch was secured for another generation of Vanes. But I acknowledged the permanent scars left behind. Caleb was facing years in a federal facility for his part in the fraud, and Elias would likely never see the outside of a cage again. Justice takes time, but the land always remembers, and the soil beneath my boots felt solid for the first time in months. I stood there as the crisp light of March spilled over the valley, watching the long shadows of the herd stretch across the pasture like a blessing. I realized then that my legacy wasn't the dirt, or the cattle, or the bank account Elias had tried to drain with such surgical precision. My legacy was the truth that had survived the storm, and the woman who was currently walking up the trail to find me. Rest easy, Eleanor. We're home, I murmured to the wind, the warm golden glow of the sunset reflected in my eyes. I turned away from the sunset and saw Eleanor walking toward me, her hand reaching for mine, and for the first time in 2 decades, the name etched into the steering column of my heart felt whole again. The story of our survival concludes here, but the legacy of Silver Creek begins a new chapter in the morning light. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized my greatest mistake was believing silence could protect a family. I thought patience and trust would keep peace in my home, but instead they allowed family betrayal to grow where I refused to look. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Don't ignore the small warnings that something is wrong. Family betrayal rarely appears overnight. It grows quietly through secrets, pride, and the fear of confronting those we love. When we stay silent too long, the damage spreads further than we ever imagined. What saved my life and my legacy was not revenge, but truth. In the end, the only real victory came when the truth stood in the open and everyone could see it. That moment of family justice restored more than my land. It restored dignity and honesty to a broken family. True family justice is not about punishment. It's about exposing lies so healing can begin. Even after deep wounds of family betrayal, a family still has a choice: continue the darkness or face the truth together. Today, my belief is simple. Protect your family, but never protect a lie. A family built on honesty can survive almost anything, but one built on deception will eventually collapse. I believe God sees what happens in the dark corners of our lives, and in His time, truth always rises. Because of that faith, I also believe real family justice eventually finds its way into the light. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I'd truly value hearing your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in Silas Vane's situation facing betrayal inside your own family? Share your perspective in the comments. If this story moved, you consider subscribing so you won't miss future stories. Please note, while inspired by real-world themes, certain details were dramatized for storytelling. If this type of content isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that may suit you better.